When it comes to Nickelodeon's theatrical output, most of their movies seem to follow a similar distinct pattern, usually having a somewhat out there and absurd concept in the same vein as their most popular TV shows Rugrats or SpongeBob SquarePants, which is what makes the Best Animated Feature winning Rango such a black sheep among their efforts, as aside from a few standard gags found in most animated movies, it has very little in common with their typical formula and instead serves as an ode to westerns from the golden age of Hollywood, if with a few twists. And while that may appear at first glance to be a first for them, considering what the studio is normally known for, Nickelodeon is actually no stranger to the Western genre, with one of their previous efforts, Barnyard, actually sharing many traits with the genre despite appearing to be a satire of teenage roughhousing at first glance. But when you look at it a little deeper, Barnyard actually has almost all the hallmarks of a typical Western story, even if it isn't as obvious as in Rango. And today, I'd like to go over these two movies and see which of them actually makes for the better animated modern Western. And obviously there will be spoilers for both films ahead, so in case you haven't seen either of them yet and don't want to know what happens, you should probably click off the video. Okay, so to point out the obvious here first, Rango is a better made movie than Barnyard overall. Even a non-film expert like me can easily make that distinction. Though, as I got into in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, that's not to say Barnyard is as bad as its reputation implies. But to stay on topic, the point of this video isn't which movie is objectively better, as once again, that's pretty obvious regardless of one's personal preferences, but which movie makes for the better Western. And to once again point out the obvious here, Rango makes it extremely apparent right from the get-go that it's an animated Western, while the connections Barnyard has to the genre are a lot more subtle, but still there nonetheless. Because the whole basic plotline even contains many different aspects of Westerns in it. Specifically, you've got a family that needs to protect a farm and everybody who lives on it from a group of dangerous killers, only for said killers to show up and kill the patriarch of the family, forcing his child to have to rise up and protect the farm while constantly questioning his ability to do just that. But after some trials and tribulations, he finally gets the confidence to stand up to his father's murderer and not only get his revenge, but also ensure that they never threaten his home and those he loves again. Heck, even the final battle between Otis and Dag is very reminiscent of Westerns, with most of it being about building as much tension as possible, while the battle itself is won in only a few seconds. So once again, while it might not seem like it at first, Barnyard actually shares quite a lot in common with Westerns, particularly in how its plot is structured. But that isn't to say it's exactly the straightest example of a Western either, as it does play rather fast and loose with the genre's tropes in several regards. And yes, the fact that it does take place in modern times is one such thing, with there even being a memorable sequence of Otis and his friends being chased in a car by a helicopter. But there's also such things as Otis not seeking revenge on Dag until towards the end, when in most Westerns that would be the motivation of the child from the start, Otis having an extreme party animal problem, which is the main reason he has difficulty being a leader as opposed to just not being ready, and the older, wiser mentor figure is a lot subtler in how he tries to help Otis than the equivalent character would be in a regular Western. As well as that the movie is in many ways more a coming-of-age story, with some of the aforementioned satire of teenage roughhousing, and plenty of standard Nickelodeon humor added to the mix. So to put it simply, if nothing else, Barnyard is most definitely not a conventional Western by any means. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it's a badly told one either, as when looked at solely through that perspective, it is actually pretty well done, especially when it comes to the final confrontation between Otis and Dag. Now, by contrast, and as I already noted, Rango makes it obvious right from the start that it's a Western story, and moreover has absolutely no problem committing to what most love about the genre. As I even got into in my video on the movie, which you can also find a link in the description to, Rango is honestly a true example of a Western, and one of the few released in modern times to not subvert the genre in any way, instead serving as a perfectly sincere love letter to the classic Westerns of the golden age of Hollywood. And his scene with the spirit of the West is particularly notable in this regard, because that's honestly exactly how you'd expect the embodiment of the classic Western to behave in human form. A fair, blunt figure of wisdom that tells lost people exactly what they need to hear, to encourage them to do what's right in a land so unforgiving that the temptation to just walk away from one's principles is overwhelming. But as I got into in my video on Westerns, which you can also find a link in the description to, that's really what the genre was all about. People being able to up and prevail, become the best version of themselves, even in such an unforgiving environment. And once again, the way Rango is able to embody all of that in the spirit of the West is really an impressive feat, especially considering he's on screen for less than 2 minutes, and shows just how well the people behind this understood what the Western is really all about. And what's particularly notable is that, as Rango himself points out, he's not even supposed to be there, and yet the spirit still helps him all the same. Because it doesn't matter what he's supposed to be, or if he's ultimately nobody special. If he needs help, the spirit will help him. Which also ties back to how the theme of redemption was not only a common fixture of Westerns, but how anybody, regardless of who they were or what role they played in the story, could earn it if they worked hard enough for it. And finally, there's the fact that he's modeled after Clint Eastwood, whose demeanor perfectly articulates everything he represents. And that's not even getting into everything else this movie gets right about Westerns. From the stranger coming to a desperate town in need and quickly becoming the sheriff, the use of typical Western apparel complete with era-appropriate guns, the theme of the frontier's ultimate death in the face of progress, a temperamental family nobody likes that turns out to be a red herring and even helps out the good guys at the climax, a menacing bounty hunter who terrifies everybody with his mere presence and dead shot alone, corrupt politicians taking advantage of a lawless town to suit their own needs, and finally, and very similar to Otis and Barnyard, Rango finally shedding his fear to become the hero he needs to be in order to save those he's come to care about. Though, of course, a big difference here is that Rango becomes that hero by being willing to kill, while Otis does so by not being willing to at the crucial moment, which is another common fixture of Westerns. Specifically, the hero learning when it is and isn't right to kill, and thus causing the outcome to be different from story to story. So it should be pretty obvious by now, if it wasn't obvious to begin with, one can pretty safely say that Rango does make for the more effective Western overall. But that's not just because it looks more like a Western, has a lot more Western tropes associated with it, and ultimately advertised itself as such. Instead, it's because of how well it understands the Western genre, as I already noted in the Spirit of the West scene. And all of those Western templates I just went over, it doesn't just use them, but knows how to use them for maximum effect as well. Because Rango, for example, he doesn't just ride into town and take charge. Instead, he's a fish out of water, completely out of his element, and has to invent his tough guy persona to get ahead, only to actually become the tough guy he's pretended to be in order to win the day. And as I noted before, the need to stand up for what's right, even when everything is stacked against you, is a very important element of Westerns. And obviously I could go over plenty of other examples of how this movie uses and understands Western tropes. But since I don't want this video to be an hour long, all I'll say is that this movie's understanding of the Western genre is better than most these days, and as such, makes for a very effective love letter and ode to the golden age of the genre. But that being said, that doesn't mean Barnyard makes bad use of the Western template, especially because, as I noted before, some of the best scenes in the film come directly from that template. It's just that it doesn't have the commitment or such a deep-rooted understanding of the genre as Rango does. But as I also noted before, at the end of the day, it wasn't really trying to be a Western, and was more borrowing basic elements and templates from it in order to give the story more dramatic weight. And there's nothing wrong with that. All that means is that Rango makes for a more effective example of an animated Western done right, and may have even set the standard for it in many regards. But since Barnyard wasn't really trying to do that anyway, it can't be judged too harshly for what it did do instead. It's not really a one-to-one comparison here. To put it simply, Rango and Barnyard might be two completely different movies, but they both do a pretty good job when it comes to the Western elements in their stories. But because Barnyard is a combination of many different things, as well as more interested in quite a few of those other aspects, it doesn't make for the best example of the genre out there. While Rango, by contrast, not only tries to be as close to the Western in every way it possibly can, but also has a very deep-rooted understanding of the genre that may just make it one of the best examples of it in recent memory, animated or otherwise. And while most of you probably felt that outcome was a foregone conclusion, it is still interesting to note how much Barnyard really does fit the Western template, considering how far removed it appears to be from it at first glance, even if it still ultimately couldn't compare to Rango in that department. Okay, I think that's everything I've got on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that both Rango and Barnyard actually make for pretty good animated westerns when examined in the context of the genre, even if Rango is obviously the better one? Or do you believe that there are much better animated representations of it out there? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as I always say, you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video just because you watched it. You can feel about both Rango and Barnyard any way you'd like to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is perfectly okay. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.